with all the sessions, especially if you're in UK or in another parts of the world where it's getting a bit late. So hello everyone, wherever you may be. So today I'm going to be talking to you about DevOps and ALM for Power Platform in the financial services. So before I start, just a quick intro about myself. So I am a Microsoft MVP. I've been working with Microsoft technologies, starting with Microsoft Dynamics and moving on to Power Platform and Azure for over 15 years. And most of my experience has actually been, working for various, financial services organizations, of different kind of scales, small, medium, large. So I'm really excited today here to be talking to you about DevOps and what does that mean for you, especially when you're working for organizations like financial services. So there are a few details here, including my kind of different contacts. So if you have any questions after this session, feel free to reach out to me into any of these channels, and you've got also some links to my kind of blogs and YouTube and website, etc. So I'll share these on the chat after the session. Okay, so let's get started. So the question I think we're going to be covering today is, obviously the context is financial services. I normally do lots of talks around DevOps and how to implement DevOps. So today is not going to be a session where I'm gonna show you like basically how to set up a pipeline, from start to end. I'm going to be talking about DevOps and what does that mean in terms of financials? Is that different basically when we do DevOps in the financial services, or is it the same? And what are the things that you need to consider when working in financial services or kind of similar type of organizations? I'm not going to answer the question now, but hopefully throughout this session you will get to see different things that you need to consider, and that can give you an idea in terms of what you expect and what are some of the challenges that you may need to face or be basically considerate of when you're working in these kind of environments. So before I start, I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction to DevOps. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with DevOps. It's a term that's been around for a while, but just to set the scene, just do a little bit of a recap. So DevOps is basically the process where it starts from the time when we have an idea and we want to do something until we have that idea implemented in production and some feedback as well around whether that idea has worked or not. So these are the different stages that a typical DevOps value stream would include. So it starts with planning in terms of what is it that we want to do, and that is quite important, because if we can't basically agree on what is it that we need to do and what is important, what can wait till later, then we're likely not going to end up with the right product. So once we know what is the product that we're building, then we move into development, and this is where you would configure, customize, all this kind of stuff, come up with something in Power Platform. Typically, that is followed by a peer review, and that is quite important, especially if you're working in large organizations, such as financial services. You typically will have larger teams, so you would want to have a peer review process, and that can serve a number of different purposes. So one of them is, get somebody else to just have a look at, what has been done to get an idea. Two, it's more of like an audit point. Somebody else has reviewed your requirements, to make sure that there's nothing from a security perspective going on in the code as well. And, it forms part of the natural DevOps process as well in terms of, commits and, pull requests, etc. So once we've got that passed with that peer review process, then we move into the kind of automated build process. So this is where we would take, that idea or implementation and then turn it into some package. We can run some checks again. Security checks are important at this stage in terms of code scanning, all this kind of stuff. So at the end of that process, if everything passes, then we get a package. Then, we look at, where do we want to deploy that package? So this is where environments come into play. And this is where we would then, either create a new environment or use an existing environment. And then we would deploy, that package to a number of different environments. At some point, we'll get that deployed to production. Once it's deployed, obviously, we need to monitor it. Is it doing what it needs to do? Is there any errors with it, etc.? And then getting feedback from the different stakeholders and users. And then that feedback then goes all the way back into planning, and then the cycle goes on. So these are the different stages, and these stages would be the same, no matter, I think, what kind of organization you're kind of implementing DevOps in. But the complexity in each stage may vary depending on the size of the project, the team, the organization, the controls, etc. So some of the things that are quite important as well, some of the DevOps principles that you would need to bear in mind. So one of them is fast flow. As you've seen from a number of presentations today, things are changing really fast, and the dev team or the team that is kind of building solutions on the Power Platform, need to react very quickly. The platform is very good at building things quickly because it's low code. So we need to have, the right processes in place to be able to move that implementation all the way, from somebody building something or an idea until it ends to the users. So that is quite important to move quickly across all these different stages. We don't want to build something for 3 to 6 months and then, find out that, it's not what we needed, or, the market has changed now and, we need it differently. So the idea is that, to prioritize, get the changes as small as possible and get these moved across all these different changes, because, you get the value straight away and you get a chance to feed back into that. So to move across all these stages quickly, we need automation. So we can't afford to be doing manual deployments, manual testing, all this kind of stuff. It does make sense in some scenarios, but if you're working at a large scale, you want to make sure you have as much automation in place as possible. Again, if you're working in large organizations, the chances are there's lots of different teams, different pods, different things happening, different responsibilities. So from a DevOps perspective, ideally, you want to minimize the handoffs as much as possible. So, make sure if you do have to hand off, that the next person knows exactly what needs to be done to kind of minimize that moving back and forth between, communication, basically going back and forth. So you raise for example, a tester, for example, raises a bug and then doesn't put enough information, so it has to go back to the dev team then have to go back to the tester. So, if you're handing off, make sure the next person basically in the line's got everything they need to do to take that forward without having to come back to you, ideally. And finally, again, communication and collaboration is key, especially if you've got multiple teams working on the same thing or different teams involved, like security, architecture, all this kind of stuff. So we need to make sure that everyone is communicating and collaborating and they're on the same page, because it can be easy to kind of, drift, and, it can be difficult to come back. So how do we get these things done? So we need to shift left. So shift left means basically do things as early as possible. So start testing as early as possible, start getting feedback as early as possible, move some of the testing into automated testing upfront, move the scanning upfront, start scanning early. You don't want to build all your code and then scan it, for example, if you have code, obviously, or even if you're using some of the kind of low code scanning tools as well. So the more we shift left, the more we kind of know about things early. So again, that's quite important. And finally, goes with shift left is the fast feedback. So we need to ensure that we're getting feedback as early as possible so we can adjust and move forward. So this is just an introduction. I think these are kind of key principles that apply to a lot of DevOps implementation, and especially in large organizations such as financial services. So moving on. So what are the key focus areas. So if we are talking about highly regulated organizations, kind of typically large organizations as well, in addition to some of the things that may not apply to other organizations, these are some of the key areas that we need to focus on. So one of them is security. So what does security mean? Basically, we need to make sure that everything that is implemented is secure and safe. We need to make sure that we've got the right controls. We're aligning to the policies, and in Power Platform that could mean a number of different things. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But security is probably one of the very important factors. The next one is around governance. So typically, there will be processes in place. There will be standards. So when we come to implement Power Platform projects, we may need to bear these processes and standards in mind, and we may have to maybe adjust or challenge some of these in some cases, because maybe it's a slightly different way of terms of building low-code applications than maybe other types of applications. And finally, around scale. So if we want to scale and have lots of applications, lots of deployments, then we need things like automation. We need accelerators. We need to be able to have consistency. We need to be able to kind of be able to manage things at a very large scale and be efficient. So I'll show you examples of what that means from a DevOps perspective. I mean, these probably apply to lots of other areas. So today's presentation is about DevOps. So I try and keep these areas focused on DevOps. By the way, Raz, if we have any questions along the way, I'm happy to answer these as we go along. And I'm happy to take questions at the end as well. Okay, so first topic is around security. So we typically this is the typical setup. Basically, we have an Azure tenant, which contains Azure Active Directory. That's the dependency for Power Platform. Then we would have a number of Power Platform environments, and within the environments, we would have apps, flows, virtual agents, Dataverse potentially, and then we would have connectors. So we could leverage other data sources in Azure and outside of Azure and on-prem and other places, as per requirements. So as you can see, there are some red boxes around most of these things. So that means that we need to apply security and controls around each of these boxes. So what does that mean? So let's start with the tenant. So in the tenant, we would typically have AD policies. So AD policies are typically kind of deciding who can sign in, who can't sign in, from where you can sign in, from where you can't sign in. So from a DevOps perspective, it's unlikely that you will need to get involved with AD policies because there's probably a team that manages that. However, the thing that you need to be mindful of is things like multi-factor authentication if you're trying to use accounts, not service principals, for example. You're trying to use a service account, then if you've got multi-factor authentication, then you need to be careful around that. If you're trying to sign in maybe from a location like a DevOps agent that's not been whitelisted, then again, you need to be aware of that because that's where the problem may be. The next thing is around tenant settings. So in general, settings I think are quite important, especially default settings. So typically when you provision a tenant or an environment or something, it comes with a lot of default settings, and these may not be, the ideal settings from a security perspective. So again, it's important that you review the default settings and, decide whether the default settings meet your security requirements. So as an example, one of the default settings is who can create Power Platform environments, who can create trials. So it may be perfectly fine for one organization that everyone can create environments, but it's unlikely if it's a highly regulated environment that you would want every single person to create an environment, because ideally you want to go through some process before a team can create an environment. So that's quite important to adjust these tenant settings. The second item is around tenant access. So you want to make sure you want to look at who's got access to the tenant, and there's I think 3 roles in Azure Active Directory, which are like Power Platform Administrator, Dynamics Administrator, and Power BI Administrator. And these are quite high permissions in there. So you want to have a process around granting access to these permissions and making sure that the access is reduced to the minimum, and ideally some process around how to get access into these type of privileges as well. So again, tenant access is very important, because if the wrong person manages to get tenant access, either intentionally or unintentionally, you could cause a lot of damage. So next one is around tenant isolation. So there are some features in the Power Platform that are enabled on demand, which you can enable if you meet certain criteria. So one of them is tenant isolation, which basically controls the connections in and out of your tenants. So you can actually whitelist. So for example, if you've got another tenant, let's talk about default. So default, you probably want to turn this off, but if you get requirements to communicate with other tenants, that you can allow communications from only specific tenants as opposed to have the access open. So that's at the tenant level. Next one is data policies. We can apply these data policies at connectors, so we can limit what connectors can be used within environments. So again, from a DevOps perspective, these are important, because when you're provisioning an environment, you want to make sure that the environment's got the right policies. If you provision an environment and allow all the connectors, then probably not the smartest thing to do if you've got sensitive data in the environment. So you want to make sure you apply the policies at the time when you create the environment. So again, that's where you may want to consider you doing something in your DevOps processes. So from an environment perspective, again, we want to make sure that we've got the right access on the environments. So that means who can create the environment, but also who can deploy into the environment. So if you're working with DevOps, you want to decide who's got the access to deploy to that environment, who's got the access to make some of the high privileged changes. So that can be part of the DevOps process, but also if you're creating a new environment, whom do you want to allow access to that new environment? Again, that's something you have to consider. Environment settings, again, there are some environment settings that come by default. You may want to tweak these when you create a new environment or monitor to make sure that certain settings don't get turned on. And finally, you've got encryption. So if there is a need to apply custom encryption keys, then again, that is something you may want to consider as part of your DevOps process as well. And finally, we've got 2 things. We've got the permissions on the components themselves. So if you're deploying an app, or if you're deploying something in Dataverse, whom do you want to give access to? So again, from a DevOps perspective, you've got the ability to decide who the app is shared with what permissions. So as you can see, this is all security stuff, but it's quite related to DevOps, because in the DevOps process, you'll be ending up configuring settings, creating apps, deploying apps, all this kind of stuff. And so you need to consider security when you're implementing your DevOps processes. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some idea around security. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but happy to take questions later. So from an ALM capabilities and tooling, so one of the typical questions, for example, if you join a new organization, or if you're a partner that's about to deliver a project for an organization, one of the key questions is, what tools can I use? Can I use the tools that I want to use, or are there existing tools that I have to use? What's the pros and cons between each one? What are my key decision factors? So this slide can give you some idea around the different areas that we would kind of cover in DevOps. So from a backlog perspective, so this is where you would manage your requirements. So this is the product owner, the team working on the backlog. So the typical tools that are used in this space are kind of Azure DevOps Rules and Jira. So this is where you kind of define and manage your requirements. Then we move on to development. So this is kind of version control. Again, this is for the team to build things. So again, the tools that are typically used in this space are Azure DevOps or GitHub, or potentially some other version control systems. You can use Power Apps Checker, obviously, to check and scan the code. So after we do the development, then we go into the pipelines. This is building, deploying things, executing tests, orchestration, all this kind of stuff. So again, the tools that I typically use in here, things like Azure DevOps pipelines, GitHub Actions. Many organizations use Jenkins as well, or other kind of CI/CD tools. And if you're using Azure DevOps, these can be combined with like Azure DevOps extensions, such as Power Platform build tools, or other community tools like the XRM CI framework. And there's obviously some tools for GitHub Actions as well. And then testing. So this is automated testing and manual testing and other types of testing. So from a test management perspective, again, Azure test plans are used in many cases, and Jira can be used as well in some cases. In addition to that, obviously, you can use some frameworks for unit testing, like the fake XRM Easy. You can use the Test Automation Studio for Power Apps. You can use Easy Repro for model-driven apps. So there's lots of different tools that come into play here. And finally, once you deploy something into production, so one is typically you would have a change control system. So you can't just go into an environment and just deploy. So typically there will be a change control system like ServiceNow. So again, from a DevOps perspective, you may need to integrate with something like this. So from your pipelines, before you can deploy to production, maybe you want to check, is this a valid change? Is it conflicting with other changes? And then once you deploy it, you need to monitor the solution. So from a Power Platform perspective, there is good integration with Azure Monitor in the sense of application insights. So you can feed information into application insights and data lakes, etc. And you can generate alerts based on that. So again, that is something you typically need to consider. So I think if we look at here, there's a lot of options in terms of tools for each of these different key areas. And ideally, for example, you could use actually Azure DevOps all the way. So you could put your requirements in boards, then link that to your code in repos, and then trigger pipelines from that. So if you've got that ability, then I think you would avoid having to integrate and manage multiple systems. So that can give you like end-to-end things like end-to-end traceability, because you can link requirements all the way through to code and deployment environments, etc. However, you may not be able to do these things. So for example, you may have to kind of put your requirements in Jira, and then maybe use GitHub for your repos, and maybe use TeamCity, let's say, for your pipelines. So the options are there. I think it's a decision that you have to make based on the standards, and what is the value you would get from an integrated tool like Azure DevOps versus other tools as well. Okay. So from an automation perspective, so we talked about automation. So I just want to cover as well some of the different options you would have for automation, especially depending on some of the tools that you would pick up in the previous screen. So typically, like with Power Platform, you get out-of-the-box web APIs. So, you get some assemblies as well, and, some tools that come with the SDKs. So if you really wanted to, you could just talk to these APIs, because there will be an API, for example, to import the solution. There will be an API to kind of push data. So, this is something that you could do. So another layer on top of that, we'd have some more automation capabilities. So we got things like the PowerShell modules that come with the Power Platform. We got the CLIs that come with the Power Platform, and we got some potentially other higher level tools. So again, this one, you may not have to build, things from scratch from the core APIs. You'd get some, different commands that you can use that are slightly higher level that you can then combine and use to kind of create your automation scripts. So another layer on top of that is the DevOps tools. So these could be things like pipeline extensions, so things like the Power Platform build tools. So it already covers most of the core tasks that you would need to do from an automation perspective. So these could even be like Power Automate or Logic app connectors as well, because some of the automation you can do that way. You got some IDE extensions, like some plugins for Visual Studio and VS Code that may use all the stack below. And you've got some custom tools that may be available from community, or you may build as well. So if you want to go beyond that, and this is kind of starting to see a trend in terms of a bit more first-class experience. So so you may not want to kind of work at the pipeline level, but you may have a button, for example, in the portal that allows you to kind of kick off a deployment, or you may kind of work within Teams or something, or you may have a custom app that actually abstracts all these layers below and just gives the user one button. So again, that's kind of making it more easy for the user, and the user could be multiple users in here. It could be either the dev team, or it could be kind of someone else interacting with your DevOps environment. So in general, I think the higher you go up the stack, the productivity improves. So if you can pick up something like from the first class experience that meets all your requirements, then obviously you can get up and running quickly, and your productivity is high. But if it doesn't meet your immediate requirements, or you can't customize it to meet your needs, then you may have to go a little bit lower in the stack, and this is where you get more flexibility. But obviously, you will have to put more effort into building that. And these are just some high-level concepts that I wanted to share, but I can give you some examples in a bit as well in terms of these different areas as well. Raz, do we have any questions so far? Okay. I presume no. Okay.
Yeah, no questions at the moment.
Okay. Okay, I shall continue. So from a Power Platform development perspective, so we typically have different personas on the team, and we could have pro devs. So we could have developers building plugins, web resources, PCF controls, custom connectors, all this kind of stuff. And we have citizen developers, let's say, building apps and flows and chatbots. It could be the same person that does both, or it could be business users working with IT teams to kind of collaborate on an initiative. So the good thing is there's lots of flexibility in the platform. So you can get different people with different skills to collaborate and build solutions. So we have tools like the Maker Portal, which is kind of low code. And we've got tools like Visual Studio and VS Code and other tools that can allow you to extend the solution further. So when we talk about DevOps, we want to make sure that we've got the right tools and experience for any persona that is working on the team. So we can't just build a process that is complicated and then give it to somebody from the business to be able to kind of interact with it and then figure out what's going on with pipelines and scripts and this kind of stuff. So we probably want to build the right experience for the right user. So that is quite important. So I just wanted to share that. So from a DevOps perspective, we want to make sure that things are in version control, especially in highly regulated organizations. You want to have an audit of what things are getting changed, when, and by who. So whether it's customizations or configurations or kind of standard C# JavaScript code, we want to make sure that these things end up essentially in version control, which is basically here in the bottom right corner. So if you're a pro dev, you're building in Visual Studio, it's very easy. You commit your code directly from Visual Studio into version control. If you're a citizen dev, then you're probably configuring things here. You may not want to interact directly with version control. So there is a process that you may have to implement, which basically exports these changes, unpacks them, and then pushes them into the source control on behalf of the citizen developer. So one of the tools that's been around for a long time and has been evolving is the solution packager, which basically allows us to take a solution, which is a package that contains all our changes, and then turn that into a format that can be stored in version control. And then we can reverse that process and then take the changes from source control and then generate a package. So that is available as a command line utility. So this is how it works. You basically extract your zip file that you export from the Dataverse environment. It generates lots of files. Then we can use the same process to pack them and generate a zip file. So every time you go through that process, for example, if you make a change to the contact form, you extract, that gets stored into version control. You make another change, extract, that same file will be updated. However, fields will be added or removed, etc. So you can see the changes and the change history in version control. So that is quite key. So once we have the changes in version control, what do we do? So typical things that we want to store in version control is things like Dataverse customizations, reference data, plugins, web resources, PCF, source code, etc. So we would have a build process that would version these changes. So we want to know, what version that build is, compile, sign, minify potentially, run some tools, and ideally at the end of it generate a package. So the package, what does the package contain in this case? It's solutions, some deployment packages, data, tests that we can execute later. Once we have these packages, then we kind of move on to the release process. So we trigger a release process. What does that mean? Approvals, somebody may need to approve the release to the environment. We may need to provision new test environments. We may need to take a backup if we're deploying to an environment that we may want to consider a restore if things don't work out. We import the solutions, we execute the packages, import data, execute tests, and then, the process should be the same for all the environments. You may have some additional steps or tests that are different between environments, but in general, you want to keep the process as consistent as possible. So this is just a little bit more detail around how the pro dev commit process works. So from a pro dev, this is one of the options you can adopt. So the pro dev will kind of make their changes in the dev environment. They can export to the local machine and then push the changes into version control. And then the build can then pick up these changes and then generate a package. So that's fairly straightforward. The pro dev can handle the XML files and all the different differences and merges and all this kind of stuff. From a citizen developer, this is another kind of approach. So the citizen developer configures the changes in the dev environment, typically in a solution. Then they would trigger a process. That process then would extract the changes from the dev environment, push them into source control, and then trigger a build, and then that would generate a package. So in this case, this person here is not having to deal with version control and builds, all this kind of stuff. They just focused on configuring or building their app in here. So PowerShell and CLIs. So this is the first level of automation. So I just wanted to go quickly through some of the things that are available in the platform. So if you've not heard of, there is a tool called the Power Apps CLI. So the Power Apps CLI is a command line interface, which basically allows us to do a lot of things actually with Power Platform, and the functionality has been increasing, recently quite a lot. So the kind of things you could do is, manage your environments, manage your plugins, PCF controls, Canvas apps. You can pack, unpack. You can do lots of things with solutions. You can deploy packages, and as well now you can do Power Portals. So you can export and import, the portals content. And you can set some telemetry settings as well for the tool itself. So I would encourage you to have a look at that if you hadn't considered it. You can run it on your dev machine. So make it part of your dev, your build cycle, or you could integrate it with some automation tools as well to get some of the things done. We have some PowerShell modules as well. So for makers, there is a module which allows you to do some of the typical tasks that makers would do that may require automation, such as managing the Canvas apps or permissions, etc. There's the Power Apps admin module. This is more from an admin perspective. So you can change your tenant settings that we described earlier. You can create environments. You can manage your data policies, again, that we've spoken about from the security perspective. So the admin module kind of gives you a lot of things that you can do for managing the tenant, but also some of the security and control aspects that you can do as well if you want to automate these. Data module is one of the community as well modules. Gives you some functionality to talk to Dataverse and manage some of the things in Dataverse like mailboxes and etc. Again, have a look at it in case you want to automate something and you can't find it in any of the other modules. Power Apps Checker is another PowerShell module, so you can use these modules to run checks on your solutions. And we have another module for the configuration migration utility. So this is if you want to move data across environments. So it allows you to export the data from one environment, store it in version control, put it in another environment as well. And then we have another module for managing Power BI as well. So if you want to manage your Power BI tenant, you can use this module as well. So the reason I'm mentioning all these modules is because you may be in a position where you can use, for example, Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions, and you've got some of the utilities in there, but you may be in a position where you, for example, have to build some automations in Azure, or you have to build some CI/CD pipelines in Jenkins, and this is where all these kind of command line utilities come very handy, because you would be able to it will take a little bit more effort. You get more flexibility possibly, but you can get a lot of the things done. And finally, this is one of the community modules as well that I've kind of created primarily. It's got lots of contributions from the community. It's been around for a very long time, so it's got lots of different commands that you can execute on Dataverse from a solution perspective, from a data perspective, and lots of other areas that are kind of some of the regular tasks when you do builds and releases. Okay. So before we kind of move forward, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a demo. So from a security perspective, I think we talked about some of the tenant settings. So some of the tenant settings would be available in here. So you could, for example, decide who can create trial environments, who can create sandbox and production environments, and some of the other settings. So some of the settings are available in here. From a DLP perspective, you can manage your DLP policies and the data policies. So this is a policy, for example, that I have configured in the for the COE toolkit environment. So you can see, these are the connectors that are allowed in this environment, and these are the connectors that are blocked. So there are some new features now that are in preview. So, for example, if you go into the Dataverse connector, you can start to see, some of the features in here. There are some things. So let's look at one of the connectors, for example, in here. So, for example, if we look at let's say we want to use the Twitter connector. So, so the Twitter connector has got some additional things. So you can configure connector actions. So you can decide what actions you want to allow in this connector. And if you're working in a kind of secure environment, this is quite important, because your connector may come in with like 20 different actions, and some of them may be kind of fairly standard processes, like reading, tweets from a Twitter account, let's say, to analyze data. But publishing some information to Twitter or other data sources outside of your organization, may require approvals and investigation, whether whether that introduces a risk, etc. So these kind of things you can configure part of your DevOps process, and that can allow you to get more control over your kind of data and risk as well. I mentioned there are some AD roles like Power BI admin, Power Platform admin. So these you can look at them in your Azure AD portal. So again, you can decide who gets these roles as well. So the other thing I wanted to share is, let's have a quick look at the PowerShell. So I mentioned the Power Apps CLI. So once you install it, you can see what this does. So these are all the different features that the Power Apps CLI can give you. So for example, if you want to know what it does, you just do pack admin. It tells you what are the admin features, so you can list your environments. There's a feature here, for example, called status, which shows you if there are any asynchronous operations running in your tenant, which can be quite useful if you've kicked off something and you're not sure where it is. So you can use that. You can also see your solutions. So for example, if you want to know what you can do with solutions, you can type back solution. Again, you can see there's a lot of things, but if you want to list your solutions, for example, you can do that, and it should list the solutions that are available in the current environment that you're connected to. So as you can see, it's quite easy to do lots of things with the Power Apps CLI. So I would encourage you to have a look to see whether it can help you with some of the things that you are doing. From a PowerShell perspective, so again, I'll show you one of the modules that I have installed here. So let's see where it is. So the administration module. So again, you can see there's lots of commands in here, and there are updates regularly to these modules. So for example, if I want to see what are my current tenant settings, I can go and have a look. So you can see who can create environments. You can disable, for example, things like surveys and stuff like that. So there's another command called set tenant settings, which you can use to update. You can do things, like managing your flows. For example, you can query your environments to get the GUID of your environments. You can, get details about your specific flow. So, for example, this flow is disabled. You can, enable your flow from here quite quickly. You can see the flow is now enabled. So you can see there's a lot of things you can quickly do. So if you've got some tasks that you regularly do manually, you can quickly get them automated in PowerShell. Okay, conscious of time, I'm just going to move quickly with the DevOps tools. So in addition to PowerShell, you've got these additional tool sets that are available within Power Platform. So you've got the Power Platform build tools. So if you're using Azure DevOps, this gives you a lot of tasks to manage some of your typical operations in your pipelines. There is the Power DevOps tools as well, which is an open source tool on GitHub that has some additional actions like let's say like reference data management, environment variables, service endpoints, all this kind of stuff you can do. So again, you can take a look if there's anything that you might find useful here. There is GitHub Actions as well. So GitHub Actions is is fairly new since last year. So the actions have been increasing. So you can see there's about 20 actions now that you can use to build your pipelines and other automated processes using GitHub. There's even an action now for portal upload and download. And there's an action to kind of branch and clone your solutions as well, which is quite useful. So this is basically what GitHub Actions is about. So you got some, you got an event that triggers basically a job, and then the job can contain multiple steps, which could contain actions, but then the jobs run on a runner, which is like an agent that executes. It's open source. You got lots of triggers. You can trigger jobs, not just from a release and build perspective. You can have other jobs that do different things within GitHub. So it's more like an automation workflow. It's quite powerful if you're using GitHub Actions. And there's also lots of actions from the marketplace. It's quite flexible. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of a demo around some of the pipelines, actually. So let me just switch to a different screen. So just to give you an example, for example, so this is a pipeline that primarily uses JavaScript. So if you are, for example, using something like Jenkins, this is what you would need to do. So this is the pipeline that exports the solution and runs the Power Apps checker. So the typical things that you would need to do, for example, is make sure that the modules are installed on the agent. Then you would run a PowerShell script to export the solution. So you would have to use one of the CLIs or modules or write your own kind of commandlets to do that. and then you would kind of run your Power Apps checker, which is again executing another PowerShell script, and then you would publish the binaries. So you can see, there are, it's not that complicated, but there is a few things that you have to create these scripts, store them in version control, and then you have to obviously manage all the parameters here. So it's doable. It's not probably the most elegant solution, but on the positive side, you can you've got a lot of flexibility around what that script is doing. So where you can't do things with with typical extensions, this is you may have to resort to this anyway. So this is the same thing done using the Power Platform build tools. So again, you've got your solution export. So again, you can see the experience is a little bit better here. So you can, define your service connections and, where you want to put your solutions. It's a bit more readable. It's, you don't have to worry about scripts or anything. You can just, drag and drop these actions and, can have a pipeline up and running. So to give you some examples of a more complex pipeline using some of the other kind of tools, open source tools. So this is a pipeline that is packaging, your solutions from version control. So again, setting version, packaging the solution, running the Power Apps checker, and then, failing the build if certain criteria are not met, and then, packing some additional solutions as well. This is an example of a release pipeline. So this is some of the things you may need to do during a release pipeline. So again, there's a lot of things in here. So, importing the solution obviously is key. You may want to configure the service endpoints, import your configuration or reference data, deploy your packages, update your custom records, environment variables, secure plugin configuration, run your tests. So, all of these steps can be automated to kind of improve productivity, reduce risk, fast feedback, etc. All the things we talked about before. Again, just to show you something on GitHub Actions. So this is one of the kind of open source GitHub repos. Basically, you have a solution in here, and inside that solution, you got your, so these are the configurations that are stored in source control. But in addition to that, GitHub Actions is YAML based. So your actually code for the pipelines is in GitHub as well. So we have two pipelines here. One of them is to create a pull request from a solution. So you can see it's quite straightforward as well. You just have to build this file using some of the actions. So basically, this is an action to export the solution. So you just have to give it the environment URL, username, password, solution, and then you're exporting the managed and unmanaged solution, and then you're unpacking the solution into version control using the unpack GitHub action. And then there is a branch action as well, which kind of creates you a branch, which then you can use to create a pull request. So at the end of this GitHub action, you would have a branch that you can use to create a pull request. Then you can create another GitHub action, for example, to then pack the solution and generate a package, and then you can create another pipeline to deploy that package. So you can create as many of these as you like for any process that you want, and you can set up triggers based on what you need in your process. So it is quite flexible. So finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the first class experiences. So we didn't talk about governance and things like that. So from a governance perspective, typically you would want to have a process where you kind of keep track of what's happening in the tenant. So things like the COE toolkit can be quite useful. So if you take a look at the COE toolkit if you're not familiar with it, but it's a tool that allows you to kind of capture information from the tenant, so you can see all the apps that all the different people are building, the environments, the portals, all the different components. So it allows you to basically get insights into what's happening and allows you to take action and interact, with the different makers that are building these apps. From a first-class experience perspective, So for example, these are some of the tools that come with the COE toolkit. So things like the environment request process. So if you want to request an environment, you can send an email. Obviously, you can have another process, but you can build it within the COE toolkit itself. So you can initiate a request. One of the questions that you can get asked, for example, is what connectors you need. So you can then decide what connectors, what users need access to that environment, the name, the region, etc. And that creates a request that then needs to be approved by somebody. And once it's approved, you can obviously trigger emails using Power Automate. You can get that environment provision, send an email to the person who's asked for the request. So this is just a quite good user experience. So if you have somebody interested in an environment for a specific purpose, you can start to automate these processes. There's another module with the toolkit, with the COE toolkit for ALM. So this is where you can, again, on top of pipelines and GitHub Actions, you've got some admin screens where you can actually configure, what are your tests, dev and prod environments, and different, configuration settings for webhooks and GitHub, etc. So once that is configured, you can start to use screens like this where you can spin up projects and get your makers to not having to interact a lot with some of the low-level stuff, so you can get them to deploy solutions from here and manage pull requests, etc. So it's quite useful if it meets your needs. I think hopefully that kind of it gave you an idea in terms of what are the different options that you can use. So just to recap, I mean, you have lots of tools. You can use different tools depending on the standards that you have, depending on how far you want to go from a security perspective, how much you want to scale. So you can go all the way up from things like APIs all the way to PowerShell to some of the extensions, and then start to build some of these experiences on top of pipelines and other things that can kind of enhance the experience and increase productivity, etc. At the same time, as you can see, all of these tools always kind of talk about the DLP policies, the security aspects, just to make sure that all of that is considered as part of your DevOps pipeline, to make sure you're not only increasing productivity, but you're also kind of taking into account the security aspects, the processes, the approvals, all these kind of different things. So hopefully you found this session useful. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, you can reach out to me offline.
Thank you, Will. Wow. I always think that I've heard your session, and then you always come out with lots of new stuff. So thank you, Will, for that. There is a question by Rajiv. I don't know if you've seen it. The question is, on the Azure DevOps management, where we need to incorporate SecOps. For SecOps, do we have native Microsoft tools or have to depend on third-party tools? What's the recommendation?
So I think the typical tool that is used within Power Platform and specific for Power Platform is the Power Apps Checker. Now, this is a tool based on standards, obviously. It's more of a standards tool, kind of. It does kind of give you some of the things that are maybe security related, but it's not really tailored for that. So, it depends really what you're trying to scan, because if you're trying to scan like C# code for plugins or JavaScript code, there are some tools from the Microsoft ecosystem that you can use to kind of scan for these things. But at the same time, most of the organizations that would have, specific tools for specific purposes that, for security scanning, for penetration testing, for all this kind of stuff, which are quite easy to integrate within the source code and the kind of the pipelines that you build for the Power Platform. So it really depends on the requirement and what tools are available, but I think the options are there.
Thank you, Wale. So Rajiv, I hope that's answered your question. So remember, SecOps is a very, very wide area. And obviously this session was on DevOps. SecOps is quite different actually, to be honest, Rajiv. But Wells has shared the kind of factors that you'd be looking out for, and the tooling that's available for Power Platform in particular. So, but yeah, it's actually a good question, actually, to be honest, and I think it's something that we could maybe raise on. We actually have an ALM boot camp in a couple of months, Rajiv, and we may end up covering it on that. So anyway, and by the way, we also have the Dataverse Summit as well next month as well. So, Wale, there are no other questions. Do you have any final comments or any announcements to make?
I don't have any announcements. Hopefully, I'll be able to kind of share a lot of other things. I think today's been more like how this fits within the financial services and regulated environments. But there's lots of things that are happening from a DevOps perspective, from a Power Platform perspective. So look out for, some future sessions from me that would maybe show you things from a different angle and some of the new things that are happening. Hopefully, obviously, everyone enjoyed the event. It's been a great day full of some amazing content. So looking forward to the coming events, and thank you, Raz, and everyone for organizing. It's been great to be part of this.
Thank you, and big thank you from Nimisha. Nimisha, thank you. Always great to see you, Nimisha. Geordie as well, fantastic. Always a big excitement to see Geordie. Geordie is obviously the founder of the of Fake XRM Easy, and Wale is obviously the founder of the DevOps tool for Azure. So two amazing legends.
I'm the user of Fake XRM Easy.
Sorry?
I'm the user of Fake XRM Easy.
Yeah, exactly. Fantastic. And then thank you, Answer, Joseph. Thank you for attending. Thank you for the great feedback. Thank you, Geordie, and all the awesome people who've attended today and all the awesome speakers. Our big event of the year is going to be next month, Dataverse Summit. That's going to be huge. Literally, I'm not joking, guys. It's going to be humongous. It's the biggest event of the year, virtual event. I guarantee anyone who attends that event, by the end of day 3, you're going to be an expert on Dataverse. I guarantee it. And the reason why we're doing that event is because Dataverse is the big black hole when it comes to knowledge for most of the Microsoft community. Unless you've been working in Dynamics CRM and CE like myself, Geordie, Wale, for over 15 years, it's a bit of a niche area. However, the Dataverse Summit is going to demystify all of that. We're covering everything from functional to administration to development. So make sure you take part in that. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to give back your evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week, and see you in a month's time. So thank you, everyone. May the power be with you. Take care.
Thank you all. Have a good day or evening or morning. Bye.
Yeah, well, for some people, it's I think in India, it's almost early in the morning. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning in India. In America, it's like morning time. UK, Europe, Europe is probably midnight, all sleep. So well done to everyone who stayed online to the very end. Thank you so much. And I hope it's been highly beneficial to your careers and to your projects and to your own self-development. And see you soon. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.